On May 23, 1937, at 4:05 a.m. in his bedroom at the Casements, his winter estate in Ormond Beach, Florida, John Davison Rockefeller died peacefully at age 97, having outlived nearly everyone he had destroyed during his ruthless construction of Standard Oil, having survived longer than the thousands of workers who had perished in his refineries and oil fields, and the competitors he had bankrupted, and the business partners he had betrayed, and the politicians he had corrupted, having accumulated wealth exceeding $1 billion when that sum represented approximately 1/50th of the entire United States economy, making him not merely rich, but possessing fortune so vast that it distorted American capitalism itself and created power that rivaled the federal government's authority. He died surrounded by physicians and nurses whose salaries he paid, in mansion whose construction his monopoly profits had funded, on estate whose acres his exploitation of workers and destruction of competitors had purchased, breathing his last in luxury that would have been unimaginable to the boy born into modest circumstances in upstate New York in 1839, to the teenager who had witnessed his father's con artist schemes village, and his mother's religious fanaticism and the poverty that threatened constantly, despite William Rockefeller's occasional windfalls from swindles that brought temporary prosperity, before creditors or angry marks forced the family to relocate again, teaching young John that security required accumulation beyond what honest labor could provide, and that survival demanded methods that ethics might condemn, but that results would justify. The mansion where death claimed him stood as testament to everything John D. Rockefeller had achieved across nearly a century of relentless accumulation. The waterfront location that announced his triumph, the architectural grandeur that communicated his status, the staff who maintained perfection he could no longer directly oversee, the security that protected accumulated wealth from those who might reclaim what his monopoly had seized, the isolation that extreme wealth imposed on someone whose fortune made normal human relationships impossible because everyone either wanted something from him or feared his power or resented his methods. Because everyone either wanted something from him or feared his power or resented his methods, or simply couldn't relate to someone whose wealth exceeded imagination and whose ruthlessness exceeded comprehension.
But the mansion also contained darker truths than the official Rockefeller histories acknowledged. Witnessed secrets that philanthropy's public relations couldn't completely erase, held evidence of the human costs that building America's first great industrial monopoly had demanded, remembered the decisions made in its rooms that destroyed competitors and exploited workers and corrupted government, and created precedents for corporate power that would shape American capitalism for generations, demonstrating that fortunes built through monopolistic practices leave stains that charitable giving cannot completely cleanse, and that peaceful deaths don't erase violent legacies. What the obituaries that announced his passing failed to mention, what the memorial services attended by America's elite carefully avoided, what the philanthropic foundations he had established preferred to ignore, was the trail of destruction that paved John D. Rockefeller's path from bookkeeper earning $16 per month to billionaire controlling approximately 2% of American economy, was the ruthless elimination of competitors who stood in Standard Oil's way, was the deliberate exploitation of workers whose labor enriched him, while poverty and industrial accidents killed them, was the systematic corruption of political systems that should have constrained his power, but that his wealth purchased and his influence controlled. The mansion witnessed his final years as the industrial empire he had built was dismantled by government antitrust action that Supreme Court upheld in 1911, forcing Standard Oil's breakup into 34 separate companies, destroying the monopoly he had spent decades constructing, vindicating the critics who had called him robber baron and monopolist, and the greatest threat to American democracy that concentrated private power had ever represented. He watched from various mansions as the progressive movement he had tried to stop through political contributions and propaganda campaigns succeeded in limiting the corporate power he had wielded absolutely, as new regulations constrained the practices he had deployed to destroy competition, as his methods were condemned by courts and legislatures and public opinion that finally recognized that monopoly capitalism harmed everyone except monopolists. He died believing that his philanthropy had redeemed his business practices, that giving away portions of his fortune to universities and medical research and charitable causes had transformed his legacy from robber baron to benefactor, that creating foundations bearing his name would ensure that history remembered the good he had done rather than the evil his methods had required. That money given to worthy causes could purchase forgiveness for money taken through worthy causes' destruction. He died without apparent remorse for the competitors crushed or workers killed or democratic institutions corrupted, without seeking reconciliation with those his monopoly had harmed, without acknowledging that the mansion where he took his final breath was monument to theft masquerading as business acumen, palace built on exploitation disguised as industrial progress. The story of John D. Rockefeller's mansion is not the story that Rockefeller Foundation publicists told about self-made man who built great enterprise through innovation and efficiency, is not the sanitized narrative about visionary who organized chaotic oil industry and made petroleum products affordable for ordinary Americans. The real story is darker and more brutal and more honest. Story about what monopoly requires when built without legal constraints, about what accumulation demands when pursued without ethical limits, about what winning costs when winning is achieved through destroying everyone who competes and exploiting everyone who works and corrupting everyone who regulates. But to understand how John D. Rockefeller built his empire and his mansions and his billion-dollar fortune through methods that enriched him while impoverishing the nation's competitive markets and democratic institutions, how bookkeepers' precision transformed into monopolists' ruthlessness, how Baptist piety coexisted with business brutality, how the boy who feared poverty became the man who weaponized wealth against anyone who challenged his control. We must travel back to upstate New York in 1839, to the modest farmhouse where he was born into family whose financial insecurity and father's moral flexibility would teach lessons that would eventually build Standard Oil and destroy American capitalism's competitive foundations. Poverty's lessons. The story of John D. Rockefeller's mansion begins not in Gilded Age splendor but in Richford, New York, a small farming community in Tioga County, where on July 8, 1839, John Davison Rockefeller was born into family whose social position was respectable but whose financial situation was precarious, dependent on Father William Avery Rockefeller's uncertain income from schemes that range from legitimate timber trading to questionable medical salesmanship to outright con artistry that made the family's circumstances alternate between comfortable prosperity and anxious poverty, depending on whether William's current venture was succeeding or failing, or whether creditors or law enforcement had caught up with whatever fraud he was currently perpetrating. William Rockefeller was a charlatan who claimed to be doctor and sold patent medicines of dubious efficacy to desperate people seeking cures for ailments that actual medicine couldn't yet treat, who promised miracle results that his concoctions couldn't deliver, who moved his family frequently to stay ahead of angry customers who realized they had been swindled, who disappeared for months at a time on business trips that may have involved bigamy as later evidence, suggested he maintained second family under assumed name in different state, who taught his children through his example that morality was obstacle rather than guide, and that success came to those willing to use whatever methods produced results regardless of ethical considerations that constrained weaker men. But William also taught his son John specific lessons that would shape the business philosophy that eventually built Standard Oil. He deliberately created financial anxiety in his children by loaning them money at interest and demanding repayment with ruthless consistency, teaching them that sentiment didn't apply to financial transactions even within families, that business was business regardless of relationships, that weakness would be exploited by anyone with power to exploit it. He praised cunning over honesty, celebrated successful deception, told his children that the sharp man was superior to the honest fool, that American capitalism rewarded those who bent rules, and that only losers complained when they were outmaneuvered by competitors smarter and more ruthless than themselves. John's mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, provided counterbalance to William's amorality through fierce Baptist religiosity that emphasized hard work and frugality and self-discipline. that taught that wealth was sign of God's favor when acquired through proper methods, that instilled guilt about pleasure and suspicion of luxury and conviction, that idle time was sinful waste of opportunities that providence provided. She raised her children in an atmosphere of religious intensity that made damnation seem more real than salvation, that taught that worldly success was meaningless without spiritual redemption, that created psychological framework where accumulating wealth could be justified as fulfilling God's plan rather than satisfying personal greed. The combination of William's amoral pragmatism and Eliza's religious intensity created in young John a personality that would eventually make him perfect monopolist, capable of ruthless business practices, while believing sincerely that those practices served divine purposes, able to destroy competitors, while maintaining conviction that their destruction was simply natural selection that God intended, willing to exploit workers, while feeling no guilt because their suffering was either their own fault for insufficient effort or God's, well, that humans shouldn't question. Developing the capacity for ethical compartmentalization that allowed treating business as a moral sphere, where normal moral considerations didn't apply while maintaining personal piety and genuine religious faith. The family's frequent relocations as William's schemes collapsed or creditors closed in taught John that security was illusion, unless backed by wealth sufficient to prevent others from controlling your circumstances. That poverty made you vulnerable to forces beyond your control. That only accumulation beyond what immediate needs required could provide the buffer that prevented the anxious insecurity that characterized his childhood. When each of William's failures meant potential catastrophe, and each success meant only temporary relief before next crisis arrived. By age 16 in 1855, when John left school to seek employment, the lessons were complete. Trust no one, show no weakness, accumulate relentlessly, use any method that works, justify everything as either business necessity or divine will, never apologize because apologizing admits fault and admitting fault invites exploitation. Remember that sentiment is luxury that poor people cannot afford, and that becoming rich requires shedding the ethical constraints that keep most people poor. Understand that American capitalism was warfare, where victory went to the ruthless and defeat came to the scrupulous. His first employment was as assistant bookkeeper at Hewitt & Tuttle, a Cleveland commission merchant firm, earning $50 for 3 months' work, approximately $16 per month, barely subsistence wages, but providing the commercial experience and accounting skills that would eventually allow him to understand businesses' financial structures well enough to exploit their weaknesses, to recognize which companies were vulnerable to predatory pricing or acquisition, to calculate precisely how much below cost Standard Oil could sell to destroy competitors before those competitors' capital exhausted, and they were forced to sell or simply close. The bookkeeping work taught him that businesses lived or died based on cash flow rather than profitability, that companies could be forced into bankruptcy, even when their operations were fundamentally sound if they couldn't meet immediate obligations, that controlling credit and controlling markets and controlling distribution could destroy competitors more effectively than superior products or better service could, that the accounting ledgers that most people viewed as mere record-keeping were actually roadmaps showing where vulnerabilities existed and where pressure could be applied to maximum effect. During these years working as bookkeeper and later as commission merchant in partnership with Morris Clark, John developed the reputation for precision and reliability and absolute honesty in transactions with clients that would later seem ironic given the ruthless deception that Standard Oil would deploy against competitors. But that actually demonstrated his understanding that reputation was a valuable asset that shouldn't be squandered on small gains, when preserving it would enable larger conquests later. That being known as honest in direct dealings made the indirect manipulations easier, because people who trusted him in one context would be slower to recognize betrayal in another context. The Civil War years between 1861 and 1865 provided opportunities for enormous profits in commission trading, as government procurement and wartime scarcity created volatile markets where fortunes could be made by those with capital to invest in information about which commodities would rise or fall, where John and his partner Morris Clark accumulated tens of thousands of dollars through trading that was legal, but that profited from wartime suffering in ways that troubled some consciences, but that John's compartmentalized morality had no difficulty justifying as simply responding to market conditions that the war had created, and that someone would profit from regardless of whether he participated. But commission trading, however profitable, was ultimately dependent on external forces that John couldn't control: crop failures, transportation disruptions, government policies, competitive markets where margins were limited by other traders' willingness to undercut prices. What John wanted was business that he could control absolutely, that would generate profits through structural advantages rather than merely superior execution, that would create barriers preventing competitors from eroding the returns that initial success had established, that would transform trading's uncertain profits into monopolies' guaranteed returns. The opportunity appeared in 1863, when John invested in oil refinery in Cleveland, entering industry that was young and chaotic and characterized by wild price fluctuations and cutthroat competition and technological innovation that made today's advantage tomorrow's obsolescence. That seemed like exactly the wrong industry for someone who valued stability and predictability and control. But John recognized what others missed, that refining was bottleneck in oil industry structure, that whoever controlled refining could control the entire petroleum supply chain from wells to consumers, that consolidating the fragmented refining industry under single ownership would create power over producers and distributors and customers that could generate monopoly profits far exceeding what competitive markets would allow. This insight, that industry structure mattered more than operational efficiency, that controlling bottlenecks was more valuable than being best operator, that monopoly could be constructed deliberately through systematic elimination of competition, rather than merely happening accidentally through superior performance, was the foundation on which Standard Oil would be built, and was the beginning of John D. Rockefeller's transformation from successful commission merchant into the most dangerous threat to American competitive capitalism that the nation had yet produced. The lessons from poverty were learned, the personality was formed, the opportunity was identified, and John D. Rockefeller, age 24, stood ready to build empire that would eventually make him richest man in human history, while demonstrating that American capitalism without regulatory constraints could produce monopolies that enriched few while impoverishing many, that destroyed competition while claiming to serve consumers, that corrupted democracy while proclaiming free market superiority. Oil discovered the oil industry that John D. Rockefeller entered in 1863 through his investment in Cleveland Refinery bore little resemblance to the organized petroleum sector that Standard Oil would eventually create through systematic monopolization. Edwin Drake's 1859 discovery of oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania, had triggered rush similar to California's gold rush decade earlier, as thousands of speculators and wildcatters descended on western Pennsylvania, hoping to strike it rich by drilling wells that might produce gushers generating fortunes overnight, or might produce nothing except debts that would bankrupt the unlucky, or the incompetent, or simply those whose drilling sites happened to miss the underground pools that made neighbors wealthy, while leaving them impoverished despite identical efforts and similar investments. The refining sector that transformed crude oil into kerosene for lighting and lubricants for machinery was similarly chaotic, with hundreds of small refineries competing to purchase crude oil from producers and to sell refined products to distributors who would transport kerosene to retail customers across America and eventually across the world. as petroleum-based lighting replaced whale oil and other traditional illuminants that couldn't match kerosene's combination of affordability and effectiveness and convenience. John recognized immediately that refining's economics created opportunity for someone willing to consolidate fragmented industry through systematic acquisition of competitors. That economies of scale in refining meant that larger refineries could produce kerosene at lower per-unit costs than smaller refineries could match. That controlling significant portion of total refining capacity would provide leverage over both crude oil producers who needed buyers for their output and distributors who needed refined products to sell, creating a situation where refinery owner with large enough market share could squeeze profits from both sides of the business, while competitors with smaller operations struggled to survive on margins that consolidation was deliberately reducing. His initial refinery investment with Morris Clark and several other partners proved immediately profitable as wartime demand for lubricants and illuminants exceeded supply and drove prices to levels where even inefficient operators could earn substantial returns. But John wasn't content with merely profitable operations when his analysis suggested that refining could be far more profitable if organized as concentrated industry rather than fragmented competition. The partnership dissolved in 1865 when John outbid Clark for full ownership of their refinery, an auction that partnership's disagreements had forced, paying $72,500, enormous sum equivalent to perhaps $2 million in contemporary dollars, for assets that John intended to use as foundation for the consolidation that would eventually create Standard Oil's monopoly. With full control of the refinery, he renamed Standard Works. John implemented the operational efficiencies and financial disciplines that would become Standard Oil's trademark. Relentless cost-cutting that eliminated waste without compromising quality, vertical integration that brought supporting operations like barrel making and transportation under direct control to reduce dependence on outside suppliers who might raise prices or fail to deliver on schedule. Meticulous accounting that tracked every expense and identified every opportunity for savings that less disciplined competitors would miss. Systematic reinvestment of profits into capacity expansion that would allow capturing additional market share. But John's real genius wasn't operational efficiency, but strategic manipulation of industry structure through practices that competitors couldn't match, and that would eventually be prohibited as antitrust violations, but that during the 1860 and 1870 were simply considered aggressive business tactics that winners deployed against losers. He negotiated secret rebates with railroads that transported his oil, securing lower rates than competitors paid by promising to ship large volumes, and by threatening to build pipeline infrastructure that would bypass railroads entirely if they didn't provide favorable terms, creating cost advantages that allowed Standard to underprice competitors, while maintaining higher margins than those competitors could achieve even if they somehow matched Standard's prices. These railroad rebates represented transfer of value from other shippers and from railroad shareholders to Standard Oil and ultimately to John personally, weren't result of superior efficiency, but rather of market power that John had already accumulated and that he was using to prevent competitors from accumulating similar power, creating barrier to entry that made competing with Standard increasingly difficult even for refiners whose operations were technically as efficient as Standard's, because they simply couldn't match the transportation costs that secret agreements with railroads allowed Standard to achieve. The railroad relationships also provided information advantages that further tilted competition in Standard's favor, as railroad officials who benefited from Standard's large shipping volumes would share intelligence about competitors' shipments and destinations and volumes, allowing John to know precisely which competitors were shipping how much product to which markets, enabling Standard to target its predatory pricing campaigns precisely against refineries that were vulnerable, and to avoid wasting resources attacking competitors who had sufficient capital to survive price warfare, that Standard's deeper pockets could sustain longer than almost anyone else in the industry. During the late 1860 and early 1870, John systematically approached competitors with offers to purchase their refineries at prices that seemed generous, but that were carefully calculated to appear attractive only because Standard was simultaneously driving down those refineries' profitability through predatory pricing in their key markets, through denial of railroad access through Standard's exclusive contracts, through spreading rumors about those refineries' financial difficulties that would make banks reluctant to extend credit, creating a situation where selling to Standard at his offered price seemed like a wise decision to avoid potential bankruptcy, when in reality Standard had deliberately created the circumstances that made bankruptcy seem likely. Those who refused to sell discovered that competing with Standard was economic suicide. They would find that railroads that had previously shipped their products suddenly claimed capacity constraints or raised rates to levels that made shipping uneconomical, would discover that Standard was selling kerosene in their key markets at prices below production costs in campaigns designed not to make immediate profits, but to destroy the competitor's business by making their operations unprofitable until their capital exhausted, and they were forced to close or sell, would find that customers who had previously purchased from them were being offered Standard's products at rates they couldn't match, combined with threats that switching back to other suppliers would result in price increases that would punish such disloyalty. This systematic elimination of competition through predatory pricing and exclusive dealing and railroad discrimination and strategic information warfare and selective price cuts and deliberate creation of financial distress that made acquisition seem like rescue rather than conquest was the method by which Standard Oil achieved dominance in refining during the 1870, capturing approximately 90% of American refining capacity by 1880 through combination of operational efficiency that was real and anti-competitive practices that were ruthless and strategic acquisitions that were coerced more often than they were genuinely voluntary. John's personal role in these campaigns demonstrated the compartmentalized morality that allowed him to attend church on Sundays and teach Sunday school to children, while spending weekdays destroying competitors through tactics that any objective observer would recognize as violating the Christian principles he claimed to follow, that allowed him to sing hymns with genuine feeling, while implementing business strategies designed to crush anyone who competed with Standard Oil, that enabled him to give money to Baptist churches and missionary societies, while taking money from competitors and workers through methods that concentrated wealth at the top, while impoverishing everyone else involved in petroleum industry, except Standard Oil's shareholders. By 1870, when he formally incorporated Standard Oil Company with capital of $1 million, John had already established the patterns that would define the company for the next 4 decades, until antitrust action forced its breakup. The combination of operational efficiency with monopolistic practices, the systematic elimination of competition through financial warfare and strategic manipulation, the corruption of relationships with railroads and politicians and banks who all benefited from Standard's success, and who all had incentives to help Standard maintain dominance that enriched them even as it harmed the competitive markets they were supposed to serve. The oil was discovered, the industry was invaded, the monopoly was forming, and John D. Rockefeller, age 31, stood ready to transform from successful refiner into monopolist whose power would eventually threaten American democracy itself, whose wealth would exceed government's capacity to regulate, whose methods would demonstrate that capitalism without constraints produces not prosperity for all but extraction from many for benefit of very few who control essential resources, and who wield that control without mercy or restraint or concern for anything except accumulation that no amount would satisfy. because the boy who feared poverty had become man who could never accumulate enough to feel safe from the insecurity that childhood had instilled. Forest Hill in 1873, having accumulated wealth exceeding several $100,000 through Standard Oil's growing dominance of petroleum refining, and through personal investments that his business profits funded, John D. Rockefeller purchased 86 acres in Cleveland's eastern suburbs and began constructing the estate that would become Forest Hill, the mansion that would serve as his primary residence for decades, and where the strategic decisions that completed Standard Oil's monopolization of American petroleum industry would be made in rooms that his competitors' destruction had paid for, where the family tragedies that wealth couldn't prevent would unfold, where the contradictions between his public piety and private ruthlessness would be most apparent. The property John selected was located in East Cleveland, then still semi-rural area that was beginning to attract Cleveland's wealthiest families who wanted space and privacy that urban properties couldn't provide, while remaining close enough to city center for convenient business access, creating enclave where industrial fortunes were converting into estates that demonstrated owners' wealth, while insulating them from the working-class neighborhoods where their employees lived in conditions that those employers' cost-cutting and wage suppression had created. The mansion John commissioned was substantial but not ostentatious by Gilded Age standards, approximately 20 rooms across 3 floors, reflecting his conviction that waste was sin even when one could afford luxury, that flaunting wealth was vulgarity to be avoided regardless of how much one possessed, that simplicity demonstrated superior character more effectively than elaborate display would, creating residence that was comfortable and spacious, but that lacked the ballrooms and marble halls and imported artworks that contemporaries like Vanderbilt and Carnegie were installing in their competing monuments to industrial capitalism's capacity to concentrate wealth. The architectural style was Victorian with elements of Second Empire, featuring mansard roof and tall windows, and the kind of solid bourgeois respectability that appealed to John's self-image as serious businessman rather than frivolous aristocrat. As someone who had earned wealth through hard work and discipline rather than inheriting it through accident of birth. As Christian businessmen whose success reflected God's favor rather than mere luck, or the ruthless monopolization that objective observers recognized as actual source of his fortune, regardless of what theological justifications he constructed, to avoid confronting ethical implications of his methods. The estate's grounds were landscaped according to John's specifications, with formal gardens near the house transitioning to more natural wooded areas on the property's periphery, with paths designed for walking that would provide the exercise that John believed essential for health maintenance, with greenhouse for year-round cultivation and barns for livestock and outbuildings housing the staff necessary to maintain property of this scale, creating self-contained world where John could control everything from the temperature in his bedroom to the varieties of vegetables in the garden to the schedules that governed when gardeners worked and when household staff performed their duties. John's wife, Laura Spelman Rockefeller, whom he had married in 1864, supervised the household's daily operations and raised their children while John focused on Standard Oil's business, fulfilling the separate spheres ideology that Gilded Age gender norms prescribed, where men controlled public commerce and women managed private domesticity, where husband's success in business sphere was supposed to be supported by wife's creation of peaceful home environment that provided refuge from competitive marketplaces' demands, where children were supposed to benefit from father's financial provision without being corrupted by the methods that produced that provision. But the reality at Forest Hill deviated from this ideal in ways that revealed how industrial capitalism's demands distorted family relationships, even among those who could afford to purchase every material comfort. John's obsessive focus on Standard Oil meant he was often physically absent on business trips to New York or Pennsylvania or other locations, where monopolization campaigns required his personal attention. And even when physically present at Forest Hill, his attention remained focused on business concerns that dominated his thoughts and consumed his energy, making him emotionally unavailable to wife and children, who learned that business always came first regardless of what family occasions or needs might reasonably expect to command his attention. The mansion's private office became John's sanctuary and prison both, where he spent hours reviewing reports from Standard Oil's far-flung operations, analyzing competitors' financial situation to identify acquisition targets, planning the strategic campaigns that would eliminate remaining independent refiners, calculating the precise price points where Standard could sustain losses longer than competitors could survive, developing the tactics that would eventually give Standard control over approximately 90% of American oil refining and parallel dominance in distribution and transportation. Laura and the children, Bessie, Alta, Edith, and John Jr., learned to navigate around his schedule and moods, to recognize when he was focused on business problems and couldn't be interrupted, to accept that their needs were secondary to Standard Oil's demands, to understand that the luxury surrounding them came at price measured in their father's absence from their daily lives, that the mansion's comfort couldn't substitute for the emotional presence that John's business obsession made impossible to provide. The estate during the 1870 and 1880 also functioned as venue for the strategic meetings, where Standard Oil's executives planned their monopolization campaigns, where John would gather his inner circle, including Henry Flagler and Samuel Andrews and William Rockefeller, his brother who had joined Standard as executive after learning the business tactics that John's success had validated, to discuss which competitors would be targeted next, which regions would be the focus of predatory pricing campaigns, which railroad executives needed to be approached about exclusive agreements, which politicians needed contributions to ensure favorable treatment when regulatory questions arose. These meetings occurred in surroundings that deliberately contrasted with the brutal business tactics being discussed. The parlor where Laura served tea and refreshments, the dining room where elaborate meals demonstrated the hospitality that Christian gentlemen should offer to business associates, the library where religious texts shared shelves with account books, creating cognitive dissonance that participants apparently didn't feel, or at least didn't acknowledge, between the pious atmosphere John cultivated in his home and the predatory strategies being planned in that same home, between the Christian principles he claimed to follow and the monopolistic practices he was implementing. The staff who served at Forest Hill witnessed these contradictions daily. They saw the employer who lectured them about waste while spending millions to destroy competitors, who preached about Christian charity while calculating how to drive competing refiners into bankruptcy, who maintained household routine that included daily prayers and Sunday church attendance, while Monday through Saturday implementing business strategies that violated the commandments against bearing false witness and coveting neighbors' goods, and the fundamental Christian principle of treating others as one would want to be treated. The estate's physical layout reflected John's need for control, extending beyond business into every aspect of environment. He specified precisely how rooms should be cleaned and in what order, how gardens should be maintained and which plants should be cultivated, how meals should be prepared, and at what temperatures food should be served, creating a household that ran according to his specifications, as completely as Standard Oil operated according to his strategic directions, demonstrating that the personality that built monopoly was same personality that controlled domestic life with equivalent rigor. But Forest Hill also revealed the limits of wealth's capacity to provide security or happiness or meaningful human connection. The mansion that should have been home where a successful man enjoyed the fruits of his labor with loving family instead became workplace where business obsessions displaced family relationships. stage where John performed the role of devoted father and husband when business schedule permitted, but where genuine intimacy was absent, symbol of success that couldn't produce satisfaction, because achieving monopoly only revealed that complete control of industry didn't eliminate the childhood insecurity that had motivated the accumulation in first place. The children growing up at Forest Hill learned lessons that would shape their lives in ways that John's wealth couldn't prevent, and that his advice couldn't remedy. They learned that wealth brought isolation more than connection, that business success required sacrificing family relationships, that public piety was compatible with private ruthlessness, that their father's attention was commodity that Standard Oil consumed, and that they would receive only whatever remained after business demands were satisfied, which meant they received very little beyond financial provision that was generous, but that couldn't substitute for emotional presence they needed. Forest Hill was acquired, the mansion was built, the grounds were perfected, but the family that inhabited this estate would discover that the wealth that purchased luxury couldn't purchase happiness, that the father who provided everything material couldn't provide emotional availability, that Standard Oil's success required sacrifices that included the relationships that make success meaningful, that the mansion where America's oil empire was planned and directed was also monument to what ruthless ambition costs when pursued without limits or restraints or concern for anything except accumulation that enriches one person, while impoverishing the human connections that make that person's life worth living beyond mere survival. Standard Oil, the incorporation of Standard Oil Company of Ohio in 1870, with capital of $1 million, represented formal beginning of what would become largest and most powerful monopoly in American history. But the company's true power emerged during the 1870 through systematic implementation of tactics that competitors couldn't match and that government regulations didn't yet prohibit, through strategic use of railroad rebates and vertical integration and horizontal consolidation and predatory pricing and exclusive dealing and systematic acquisition of competitors, through combinations of voluntary purchase and coerced submission that gave Standard control over industry structure that individual operators couldn't resist. The South Improvement Company scheme of 1872, though it ultimately failed due to public outcry and independent refiners' resistance, demonstrated John's willingness to use any method to achieve monopoly regardless of how transparently corrupt those methods were. The plan involved secret agreements with railroads that would give Standard massive rebates on its own shipments, while charging competitors higher rates, and then paying Standard drawbacks, actual payments to Standard based on the shipments that competitors made, creating situation where Standard would profit from competitors' business, while those competitors paid rates that made their operations economically unviable compared to Standard's artificially low costs. When the scheme was exposed and public protest forced its abandonment, John simply shifted to more subtle versions of the same tactics, individual negotiations with railroads that achieved similar results without the transparent conspiracy that South Improvement had represented, vertical integration into pipeline construction that bypassed railroads entirely when they wouldn't provide favorable terms, strategic investments in railroad companies that gave Standard influence over rates and policies that nominally independent railroads established, creating web of relationships and dependencies that accomplished monopolistic goals without the obvious corruption that public opinion had rejected when presented openly. The Standard Oil Trust, created in 1882, represented organizational innovation that allowed coordinating operations of dozens of nominally independent companies that Standard had acquired or absorbed, creating structure where Standard Oil Company of Ohio controlled shares in subsidiary companies across multiple states, while those subsidiaries maintained separate corporate identities that obscured the extent of Standard's actual control, allowing Standard to claim that petroleum industry remained competitive with many different companies, while reality was that single organization controlled by John and his close associates directed all those companies according to unified strategy designed to maximize monopolies' profits. Through the 1880, Standard's dominance became nearly absolute, controlling approximately 90% of American oil refining by decade's end, owning or controlling the pipelines that transported oil from fields to refineries, and from refineries to distribution centers, operating the railroad tank cars that shipped finished products to retail locations, establishing subsidiary companies that controlled retail distribution in major cities, creating vertical integration from wellhead to consumer that eliminated independent operators at every stage of petroleum industry's supply chain, except for actual drilling, which remained fragmented, because Standard found it more profitable to let independent wildcatters bear exploration risks. While Standard controlled the infrastructure, those wildcatters needed to access markets for their crude. The monopoly's power over prices was absolute within markets Standard controlled. The company could raise prices to consumers when competition had been eliminated, could lower prices in specific regions to destroy particular competitors, while maintaining high prices elsewhere to fund the predatory pricing campaigns, could coordinate pricing across all its controlled entities to ensure that no genuine price competition occurred between nominally different companies that were actually all controlled by the same management, pursuing the same monopolistic strategy. The impact on workers in Standard's refineries and transportation operations demonstrated how monopoly power translated into exploitation of labor as completely as it translated into elimination of competitive businesses. Standard's refineries operated under conditions that modern observers would recognize as criminally negligent. Inadequate ventilation, exposing workers to toxic fumes. Minimal safety equipment despite obvious explosion risks from volatile petroleum products. Long hours without overtime pay, because labor markets gave workers no alternatives when Standard controlled employment in petroleum sector. Wages kept as low as possible through Standard's policy of ruthless cost-cutting that treated labor as expense to minimize, rather than as human beings whose welfare deserved consideration. Industrial accidents in Standard's facilities killed or maimed hundreds of workers during the monopoly's peak years, with companies' typical response being minimal compensation to families and no systematic improvements to safety conditions that had caused deaths, demonstrating that monopoly's power over labor meant workers bore the risks while Standard captured the profits, that human lives were simply costs of production to be managed through financial settlements that were cheaper than implementing safety measures that would reduce profits that Standard's shareholders expected, and that John's wealth depended on maintaining. The environmental damage that Standard's operations caused, oil spills that contaminated water supplies, refinery emissions that polluted air in neighborhoods surrounding Standard's facilities, waste disposal practices that poisoned soil and groundwater, when essentially unregulated because environmental protection laws didn't yet exist, and because Standard's political influence prevented local governments from imposing restrictions that might reduce profitability, even when those restrictions would have protected public health and natural resources that Standard's operations were destroying. Forest Hill, during these years of monopoly's construction, witnessed the strategic planning that coordinated Standard's nationwide operations. As John and his executives met in the mansion's rooms to review regional reports and plan acquisition campaigns, and discuss railroad negotiations, and allocate capital to the geographic markets and product lines that offered highest returns, treating the American petroleum industry as single vast enterprise to be managed according to unified strategy, rather than as collection of competing businesses, whose competition would serve consumers through lower prices and innovation that genuine markets would have encouraged. The meetings at Forest Hill revealed John's management style: absolute insistence on detailed information about every aspect of operations, unwillingness to delegate strategic decisions even when subordinates had better information about local conditions, conviction that his judgment was superior regardless of what experts or experienced operators might recommend, demand for loyalty that meant agreeing with his decisions even when those decisions were objectively wrong, creating organizational culture where questioning John's directives was career suicide, and where subordinates learned to implement his plans regardless of their private doubts about wisdom of those plans. But Standard's monopoly also demonstrated effectiveness of John's methods when legal constraints didn't prevent deployment of tactics that destroyed competition. The company's operational efficiency was real even if its market dominance came through anti-competitive practices rather than purely through superior performance. Its cost controls created genuine savings even if those savings were amplified by monopoly power that allowed extracting higher prices than competitive markets would have sustained. Its organizational innovations in corporate structure and management systems represented legitimate contributions to business practice, even if those innovations served monopolistic purposes that harmed society overall. This complexity, that Standard Oil was simultaneously most efficient refiner and most dangerous monopoly, was both organizational innovation and existential threat to competitive capitalism, demonstrated both management excellence and ethical bankruptcy, made the company difficult to assess simply, and made John difficult to categorize cleanly as either villain who destroyed competition or genius who organized chaos, when reality was that he was both simultaneously, that his success came from combining genuine business acumen with ruthless monopolization, that his wealth reflected both value creation and value extraction, that his legacy was complicated by facts that simplified condemnation couldn't capture, but that unqualified celebration would distort equally. The Standard was established, the oil was controlled, the monopoly was completed, and John D. Rockefeller stood at its peak, wealthiest man in America, and perhaps in world, controlling industry that provided illumination and lubrication to modern civilization, wielding power that rivaled government's authority, demonstrating that American capitalism without regulatory constraints would produce monopolies that enriched few while harming many, that would concentrate wealth and power in ways that threatened democratic governance and competitive markets both, that would require government intervention to prevent the complete elimination of competition that Standard Oil's success was demonstrating, was entirely possible when brilliant, ruthless man had sufficient capital and sufficient lack of ethical constraints to implement monopolization systematically rather than accidentally. Monopoly perfected by 1890. Standard Oil's dominance over American petroleum industry was so complete that the company controlled approximately 90% of oil refining capacity, owned or controlled the vast majority of pipelines transporting crude and refined products, operated thousands of tank cars and distribution facilities, employed tens of thousands of workers, and generated profits exceeding $40 million annually, some so vast that John D. Rockefeller's personal wealth had grown to approximately $200 million, making him by far the richest person in America, and quite possibly the richest human being who had ever lived when measured as percentage of contemporary GDP rather than absolute dollars. The monopoly that John had constructed through 2 decades of systematic elimination of competition represented the perfection of anti-competitive capitalism. But Standard's very success in achieving monopoly made it target for reformers and journalists who recognized that concentrated private economic power threatened democratic governance as seriously as concentrated political power would threaten it. That allowing single company to control essential industry created situation where that company's decisions affected millions of people who had no say in those decisions and no recourse when those decisions harmed them. That Standard Oil represented exactly the kind of monopolistic trust that antitrust laws were were designed to prevent, even if enforcement of those laws had been weak enough during Standard's rise, that the company had operated essentially without legal constraints. Henry Demarest Lloyd's 1881 article, The Story of a Great Monopoly, in Atlantic Monthly, was among first major publications to expose Standard's methods to national audience, describing the railroad rebates and predatory pricing and systematic destruction of competitors through tactics that any objective observer would recognize as violating both competitive markets principles and basic business ethics, presenting Standard not as an efficient organization that succeeded through superior performance, but as predatory monopoly that succeeded through eliminating competition rather than winning it. Ida Tarbell's even more devastating exposé, published serially in McClure's magazine between 1902 and 1904, and later compiled into book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, provided exhaustive documentation of the methods Standard had used to achieve monopoly: the secret railroad agreements, the predatory pricing campaigns, the industrial espionage, the bribery of public officials, the systematic lying to competitors and regulators and the public, the deliberate creation of financial crises that forced independent raffiners to sell to Standard on terms that enriched Standard while impoverishing the sellers, presenting portrait of corporate criminality disguised as business success. Tarbell's work was particularly devastating because she had personal motivation beyond journalistic duty. Her father had been an independent oil producer whose business Standard had destroyed, giving her intimate knowledge of how Standard's monopolization had affected actual families and actual communities, allowing her to write with authority and passion about human costs that dry economic analysis might miss, making Standard's predatory practices vivid through specific examples of people whose lives Standard had ruined in its pursuit of absolute market control. John's response to this negative publicity revealed the moral blindness that success had created or reinforced. He genuinely seemed unable to understand why people criticized Standard's methods, genuinely believed that the company had succeeded through superior efficiency rather than anti-competitive practices, genuinely thought that complaints about Standard's monopoly came from inferior competitors who resented being outperformed, rather than from legitimate concerns about concentrated economic power threatening both competitive markets and democratic governance. His private statements to associates and family members demonstrated this disconnect between reality and his perception. He would describe Standard as a benevolent force that had brought order to chaotic industry, would claim that the company had benefited consumers through lower prices that economies of scale enabled, while ignoring that those prices came only after Standard had eliminated competition, and that monopoly pricing that followed competition's elimination often exceeded what competitive markets had charged, would insist that workers benefited from Standard's stable employment, while ignoring the low wages and dangerous conditions and total lack of bargaining power that Standard's monopoly position allowed it to impose. Forest Hill, during these years of peak monopoly power, became fortress protecting John from the public criticism that his business methods had generated, providing sanctuary where he could avoid confronting the gap between his self-image as Christian businessman serving society and the reality that investigative journalism was documenting about how Standard actually operated and how its operations actually affected the people and communities and competitive markets that its monopolization had harmed. The mansion's isolation reflected both physical distance from Cleveland's working-class neighborhoods, where Standard's refinery workers lived in conditions that John never visited and never wanted to visit. Required, the environmental damage that Standard's operations caused became increasingly impossible to ignore as Cleveland's air quality deteriorated from refinery emissions. As the Cuyahoga River that flowed through the city became so polluted from industrial waste, including Standard's refineries' discharges, that it would eventually catch fire multiple times in the 20th century. As neighborhoods near Standard's facilities experienced health problems that residents understood came from exposure to toxic chemicals. But that Standard denied any responsibility for because environmental regulations didn't yet require companies to prevent or remediate pollution they caused. Workers in Standard's refineries during this period faced conditions that later generations would recognize as criminal negligence. Exposure to benzene and other carcinogens without protective equipment or adequate ventilation. Working with explosive materials without safety protocols that would have prevented many of the fires and explosions that killed or maimed hundreds of Standard employees across decades of operations. Shifts lasting 12 or 14 hours without overtime pay, because labor laws didn't yet require reasonable hours or premium pay for extended work. Wages kept at subsistence levels because Standard's monopoly power over petroleum sector employment meant workers had no alternatives except accepting Standard's terms or leaving the industry entirely. The company's response to industrial accidents demonstrated how monopoly power translated into disregard for human life. Standard would typically offer minimal compensation to families of workers killed in refinery explosions or other accidents, would resist any acknowledgement that companies' inadequate safety measures had caused deaths, would fight workers' compensation claims through legal tactics that exhausted families' resources, and forced them to accept settlements far below what their losses justified, would refuse to implement systematic safety improvements, because costs of settlements to injured workers or their families were lower than costs of safety measures that would have prevented injuries and deaths. John personally approved these policies through his insistence on ruthless cost-cutting that treated worker safety as expense to minimize rather than as moral obligation to fulfill, through his conviction that workplace accidents were either workers' own fault for insufficient care or were simply inevitable costs of industrial operations that management couldn't prevent, and therefore shouldn't be expected to pay for beyond minimal compensation that kept settlement costs below what genuine damages would have required. His religious faith somehow coexisted with these business practices without apparent cognitive dissonance. He taught Sunday school classes where he lectured children about Christian duty and moral behavior, while spending weekdays implementing policies that violated those very principles. Attended church services where ministers preached about caring for the poor and the vulnerable, while his business systematically exploited workers and destroyed competitors. Gave donations to Baptist causes and missionary societies, while taking far more from workers and consumers and competitors through Standard's monopolistic practices that concentrated wealth upward, while impoverishing those below. The Forest Hill estate during these peak monopoly years hosted gatherings that mixed business strategy with political corruption. As John entertained politicians whose support Standard needed to prevent regulatory interference with its monopolistic practices, as campaign contributions were discussed alongside social pleasantries, as the mansion's hospitality served to cement relationships with senators and representatives and state legislators, whose votes could be purchased through donations that were tiny fractions of the monopoly profits that favorable legislation would preserve. These political investments were remarkably efficient, spending thousands or tens of thousands on campaign contributions and lobbying would preserve monopoly profits worth millions, making corruption economically rational from Standard's perspective, even if it was ethically indefensible and democratically corrosive, demonstrating how concentrated economic power could be converted into political power that would protect the economic power from democratic challenges that voters might otherwise impose through their elected representatives. Standard's political operation extended beyond campaign contributions to include propaganda campaigns designed to shape public opinion about monopolies and regulation, funding economists who would publish articles arguing that big business served consumers better than competitive markets would serve them, supporting newspapers that would print favorable coverage, while punishing through advertising boycotts those publications that printed critical stories, creating what later generations would recognize as sophisticated public relations, designed to manufacture consent for economic arrangements that served Standard's interests while harming public welfare. John's personal wealth during this period grew so rapidly that he struggled to deploy it productively. The monopoly profits that Standard generated exceeded his capacity to spend or even to invest in ways that would generate returns comparable to what Standard itself produced, creating a situation where wealth accumulated faster than he could manage it, where his fortune became almost abstract number rather than concrete assets he could comprehend or control, where being worth hundreds of millions became curse as much as blessing, because managing that wealth became full-time occupation that consumed the time he might have spent on relationships or pursuits that would have made wealth meaningful beyond mere accumulation. The mansion witnessed this transformation of John from active monopolist to passive wealth manager, from someone who controlled industry to someone who was controlled by fortune he had accumulated, from master of Standard Oil to servant of wealth that demanded constant attention to prevent the erosion that inflation or poor investments or economic downturns could cause if vigilance faltered, and if the fortune that had taken decades to build was allowed to dissipate through insufficient oversight. The monopoly was perfected, the wealth was maximized, the power was absolute, but the victory was revealing itself to be curse rather than blessing, achievement that brought isolation rather than satisfaction, success that produced anxiety about preserving what had been won rather than joy about having won it, demonstrating that accumulation without limits was addiction that couldn't be satisfied regardless of how much was accumulated, because the poverty's terror that had motivated the accumulation persisted despite the wealth that should have eliminated the insecurity, but that instead merely transformed it from fear of not having enough to fear of losing what had been gained. Family cursed behind Forest Hill's prosperous facade and Standard Oil's commercial triumph. The Rockefeller family was discovering that wealth purchased luxury but couldn't purchase happiness, that monopoly profits could build mansions but couldn't build meaningful relationships, that John's success in business corresponded directly to his failure in family life, where the same obsessive focus and ruthless prioritization and emotional unavailability that built empire destroyed the intimate connections that make life worth living beyond mere survival and accumulation. John D. Rockefeller Jr., the only son among John and Laura's 4 surviving children, bore a particular burden of inheriting father's name and fortune, without inheriting the personality traits that had built that fortune, without the ruthlessness that business success had required, without the moral flexibility that allowed compartmentalizing Christian principles from business practices that violated those principles. Growing up in shadow of father, whose accomplishments were so vast that any achievement Junior might claim would seem insignificant in comparison, while any failure would seem like betrayal of family legacy. Junior suffered nervous breakdown in his 20s, experiencing what contemporary medicine would recognize as severe depression and anxiety triggered by the impossible pressures of being John D. Rockefeller's heir, by expectations that he would somehow equal or exceed father's business success, by the psychological weight of inheriting fortune built through methods that Junior's more sensitive conscience couldn't easily reconcile with the Christian principles that both father and son claimed to follow, but that father had violated systematically while building Standard Oil. The breakdown manifested in physical symptoms that doctors struggled to diagnose: chronic digestive problems, insomnia, nervous exhaustion that made even simple tasks feel overwhelming, depression that made life seem pointless despite having every material advantage, demonstrating that wealth couldn't cure mental illness and might actually exacerbate it by creating pressures that someone without wealth wouldn't face, by making personal problems seem illegitimate when you had resources that most people lacked, by isolating you from normal human experiences that might have provided perspective on your suffering. John S.R.'s response to his son's breakdown revealed the emotional limitations that business success had created or reinforced. He viewed Junior's problems as weakness to be overcome through discipline and prayer, rather than illness requiring compassionate medical treatment. Prescribed the same hard work and self-denial that had built his fortune, rather than recognizing that what had worked for him might be exactly wrong prescription for son with different personality and different needs. Demonstrated that even within his own family, he couldn't escape the businessman's mentality that viewed problems as challenges requiring solutions, rather than as human suffering requiring empathy. Bessie Rockefeller, the eldest daughter, married Charles Strong in 1889, in wedding that Forest Hill hosted with appropriate grandeur. But the marriage was unhappy almost from beginning, as Charles proved to be unsuitable husband more interested in Rockefeller wealth than in Bessie herself, creating situation where Rockefeller money attracted exactly the kind of person that money should have allowed the family to avoid, demonstrating that wealth made genuine relationships more difficult rather than easier, because you could never be certain whether people valued you for yourself or for your fortune. The marriage deteriorated over years of Charles's financial mismanagement and possible infidelity and general failure to live up to expectations that came with marrying John D., Rockefeller's daughter, creating scandal that family wanted to avoid, but that couldn't be entirely suppressed, forcing Bessie into choices between staying in unhappy marriage to preserve family reputation or divorcing and facing social stigma that divorce carried in late 19th century, even when husband's behavior clearly justified ending the marriage. Alta Rockefeller, second daughter, seemed initially to navigate family dynamics more successfully, marrying E. Parmalee Prentice in 1901 and maintaining marriage that avoided the obvious problems that Bessie's marriage had created. But Alta struggled with health problems that may have been psychosomatic responses to family pressures, experiencing chronic illnesses that doctors couldn't adequately explain or treat, spending years as semi-invalid whose suffering was real even if its causes were psychological rather than purely physical. Edith Rockefeller, youngest daughter, married Harold McCormick of the International Harvester family in 1895. The pattern across all four children's lives was remarkably consistent. Wealth created problems rather than solving them. Inherited fortune attracted wrong people for wrong reasons. Family name brought pressures that undermined rather than supported psychological well-being. John's emotional unavailability during their childhoods created deficits that adult wealth couldn't remedy, demonstrating that neglecting children while building fortune meant losing relationships that couldn't be rebuilt once children reached adulthood and had developed their own defensive mechanisms against father, who had never been emotionally present even when physically present at Forest Hill. The grandchildren's generation showed similar patterns of struggle despite, or perhaps, because of the vast wealth they inherited. Alcoholism, divorces, psychological problems, the various pathologies that afflict families where money removes normal constraints and normal motivations, but can't provide meaning or purpose, or the sense of earned achievement that builds genuine self-esteem, rather than the hollow pride that comes from inheriting rather than building, from being rather than doing, from having rather than accomplishing. John Jr.'s children, including Nelson, who would become vice president, and David, who would become banking executive, and Lawrence, who would become venture capitalist, achieved significant accomplishments in their own right. But even their successes were shadowed by questions about whether they would have achieved what they achieved without family name and family fortune, providing advantages that talent alone wouldn't have secured. Whether their lives demonstrated merit or merely demonstrated what inherited wealth could purchase in terms of opportunities and second chances, and the various privileges that money provides. Forest Hill, during these years of family struggles, witnessed the human costs that monopoly profits couldn't compensate for. the son's breakdown occurring in rooms that Standard Oil had paid for, the daughter's marital problems unfolding in mansion that was monument to father's success, but couldn't provide the emotional foundation that successful marriages required. The grandchildren's visits revealing that each generation inherited wealth, but also inherited the psychological damage that acquiring that wealth had inflicted on previous generations. Laura Rockefeller, the wife who had maintained household while John built empire, died in 1915 after 51 years of marriage that had brought her wealth and status, but that had also brought loneliness when husband's business obsessions left her essentially alone, even when he was physically present. That had brought social prominence, but that had also brought knowledge that her husband's fortune came through methods that violated the Christian principles she sincerely held. That had brought material comfort, but that hadn't brought the emotional intimacy that marriage should provide, but that John's personality and business focus had made impossible. Her death removed the one person who had known John before Standard Oil's success, had transformed him, who had witnessed the transformation from ambitious young businessman into ruthless monopolist, who had maintained household routines and family connections and social relationships that John's obsessions would have destroyed if left to his management. With Laura gone, John's isolation increased as the buffer she had provided between him and his children disappeared, as the household management she had handled fell to staff who served rather than shared, as the emotional connection she had maintained despite his unavailability was revealed to have been holding family together in ways that became apparent only after her death exposed how fragile those connections were. John's reaction to Laura's death was characteristically compartmentalized. He grieved genuinely, but briefly, mourned in ways that religious faith prescribed, but that didn't interfere with business routines, resumed normal activities quickly, because dwelling on loss seemed like weakness that discipline should overcome, demonstrating that even in personal loss, he maintained the emotional control that had served him in business. But that prevented the vulnerability that genuine grief requires, and that processing loss demands if healing is to occur, rather than merely suppression of feelings that would resurface later in destructive ways. The family was cursed not by supernatural forces, but by natural consequences of choices John had made throughout his life. The prioritization of business over relationships, the emotional unavailability that wealth accumulation had required, the methods that built fortune while building walls around the man who built it, the success that came at cost of human connections that make success meaningful beyond mere accumulation, demonstrating that you can win commercial battles while losing family wars, that you can achieve monopoly while destroying intimacy, that you can accumulate billions while impoverishing relationships that no amount of money can purchase or rebuild once the damage is complete. The curse was real, the damage was permanent, the costs were incalculable, and John D. Rockefeller, wealthiest man alive, stood alone in mansion that his fortune had built, but that his family increasingly avoided, surrounded by wealth that couldn't purchase the relationships he had sacrificed to acquire that wealth, learning too late that winning everything in business meant losing everything that mattered beyond business, that monopolizing industry meant being monopolized by work that consumed life, until nothing remained except money that couldn't buy time back or relationships rebuilt, or the years with children that obsessive work had stolen, and that no amount of wealth could recover. Empire shattered the United States government's antitrust case against Standard Oil, filed in 1906 under President Theodore Roosevelt's administration, and prosecuted vigorously through years of legal battles that would finally reach conclusion in 1911, represented the progressive movement's determination to break the monopolistic trusts that Gilded Age capitalism had created, to restore competitive markets that concentrated economic power had destroyed, to demonstrate that American democracy could control private economic power that had grown so vast that it threatened democratic governance itself by corrupting political institutions, and eliminating the competitive markets that American capitalism's legitimacy depended upon. The government's case detailed Standard Oil's anti-competitive practices with devastating thoroughness. The railroad rebates and drawbacks that had given Standard cost advantages its operational efficiency alone couldn't justify. The predatory pricing campaigns designed to destroy competitors rather than to compete fairly. The exclusive dealing arrangements that prevented competitors from accessing distribution channels they needed to reach customers. The systematic acquisitions of competitors through combinations of voluntary purchase and coerced submission when refusal to sell meant facing Standard's coordinated campaign of destruction through financial warfare. That Standard's monopoly position allowed it to sustain indefinitely. John's testimony during depositions revealed the combination of genuine memory lapses that age was causing and strategic amnesia about details that might incriminate him. The careful phrasing that lawyers had coached him to use. The stonewalling that made extracting damaging admissions nearly impossible. The performance of elderly man whose memory supposedly failed whenever questions touched on topics where truthful answers would have confirmed Standard's guilt, demonstrating that even under oath he would deploy whatever tactics prevented acknowledgement of what everyone already knew about how Standard had achieved monopoly. The Supreme Court's decision, announced May 15, 1911, was unambiguous in its condemnation. Standard Oil violated Sherman Antitrust Act through practices designed to eliminate competition and create monopoly. The company must be dissolved into 34 separate entities that would compete rather than coordinate. The holding company structure that had allowed unified control while maintaining fiction of separate corporations was illegal conspiracy in restraint of trade that antitrust laws were specifically designed to prevent and punish. For John personally, the decision was a devastating psychological blow, even though financial impact would prove ironically beneficial. His identity had been constructed around being builder and controller of Standard Oil. His sense of achievement came from having created the monopoly that government was now declaring illegal. His legacy was tied to the trust that courts were ordering dissolved, making the Supreme Court's decision not merely business setback, but personal repudiation, declaration that his life's work was criminal enterprise rather than legitimate business success. But the financial consequences of Standard's breakup proved unexpectedly positive, as the separated company's stock values increased when markets recognized that individual companies like Standard Oil of New Jersey, later Exxon, and Standard Oil of New York, later Mobil, and Standard Oil of California, later Chevron, were worth more operating independently than they had been worth as components of unified trust. As investors realized that breaking up monopoly didn't destroy the assets or operations, but simply reorganized them in ways that actually enhanced value by eliminating coordination that had suppressed competition between units that now competed for market share and shareholder favor. John's personal fortune actually increased following Standard's dissolution, growing from approximately $300 million before breakup to approaching $1 billion by World War I as separated companies' stock prices rose, and as oil industry expanded to meet automobile age's growing demand for petroleum products that Standard's successor companies were well positioned to supply, creating ironic situation where antitrust action designed to punish monopolists instead made him even wealthier, where government's victory over Standard Oil became personal financial triumph for the man who had built the monopoly that government had destroyed. Forest Hill, during these years of empire's dissolution, witnessed John's declining involvement in business operations as age and Supreme Court decision made his active management impossible and unnecessary. The separated companies operated under their own management teams. His wealth had become so vast that he spent more time managing investments than managing operations. His focus shifted from building empire to preserving and deploying fortune that empire had created, transforming from active businessman into passive investor living off wealth that previous decades' monopolization had accumulated. His daily routine contracted to narrower rhythms as age claimed physical capacities. Shorter walks through Forest Hill's grounds, rather than the longer expeditions that earlier years had allowed. Less time reading business reports that increasingly concerned companies he didn't control. More time in solitary contemplation or prayer, or the quiet activities that elderly wealthy men pursue when business careers have ended. But life persists through medical care that wealth provides and genetics permits, creating existence that was comfortable but empty, secure but meaningless, demonstrating that surviving into extreme old age meant inhabiting a world where nothing remained familiar, except the money that couldn't purchase purpose, to replace the business obsessions that had previously filled every waking hour. The mansion itself seemed to understand that its purpose had ended, that the strategic planning sessions and business meetings and the various activities that had animated it during Standard Oil's peak years were finished, that it was now merely residence for elderly man waiting for death that was approaching steadily, but that medical care and generally good health were delaying beyond what most humans experience, creating liminal state where John wasn't quite alive in sense of actively engaging with world but wasn't yet dead, was instead persisting in the between state that extreme old age creates for those whose bodies outlive their purposes. He spent increasing time at other properties. The winter estate at Ormond Beach, Florida, where warm climate suited aging body better than Cleveland's harsh winters. The various holdings that wealth had accumulated, and that he now circulated between according to seasonal preferences and health considerations, creating peripatetic existence where he was always visitor rather than resident, always guest in properties he owned but didn't truly inhabit, demonstrating that wealth sufficient to own multiple mansions meant never quite having home in sense that most people experience home as place where they truly belong rather than merely stay. His children visited occasionally, fulfilling duties rather than seeking connection, bringing grandchildren who barely knew the elderly man whose fortune they would eventually inherit, maintaining relationships that were cordial but not close, respecting patriarch without loving him because the emotional distance he had maintained during their childhoods couldn't be bridged simply because age had softened him, or because death was approaching, or because decades had passed since the slights and absences that had damaged relationships that never recovered despite time's passage. Standard Oil's physical breakup paralleled John's personal disintegration, as age eroded capacities that had seemed permanent during prime years. His memory fading, his strength declining, his engagement with world diminishing, his transformation from active, powerful figure into elderly dependent whose care staff managed, while maintaining fiction that he still commanded, rather than being managed by those who pretended to follow orders, while actually running household according to their judgment about what situations required. The empire was shattered not just through antitrust action, but through the inevitable disintegration that age imposes on everyone regardless of how powerful they were during prime years, through the realization that all achievements are temporary because the people who achieve them are temporary, through the recognition that monopolies can be broken by courts and empires can be dissolved by age, but that both processes lead to same endpoint where control is lost and power dissipates. And the person who wielded absolute authority discovers that authority was always conditional and always temporary, and always subject to forces beyond anyone's capacity to resist indefinitely. The shattered empire left fragments, the successor companies that would dominate petroleum industry for another century, the philanthropic foundations that would deploy Rockefeller wealth according to purposes he had established, the family members who would inherit portions of fortune he had accumulated, the historical record that would debate forever whether he was robber baron or industrial organizer, whether his methods were criminal or merely aggressive, whether his legacy was positive or negative balance, when achievements and crimes were honestly weighed against each other rather then selectively emphasized according to whether celebrants or critics controlled the narrative. Philanthropies masked the charitable giving that John D. Rockefeller began modestly during Standard Oil's early years and expanded dramatically as his fortune grew represented either genuine religious conviction that wealth carried obligations beyond personal consumption, or cynical public relations designed to rehabilitate reputation damaged by exposure of monopolistic practices, or complex mixture of both motivations that made simple assessment impossible, because human psychology rarely produces pure motives unmixed with self-interest, even when genuine idealism is present alongside more calculating considerations. His early donations to Baptist causes reflected his sincere religious faith. He gave to the church where he attended services, supported missionary societies spreading Christianity, funded colleges training Baptist ministers, contributing sums that were significant relative to his income even before his wealth reached the vast levels that Standard Oil's monopoly would eventually generate, demonstrating that charitable impulse existed before public relations needs made giving strategically valuable beyond its religious significance. But as Standard Oil's monopoly attracted criticism, and as muckraking journalists exposed the ruthless methods that had built his fortune, philanthropy's strategic value became apparent. Giving away millions to universities and medical research and charitable foundations generated positive publicity that balanced negative coverage of Standard's business practices, created narrative about beneficent billionaire improving society that competed with narrative about robber baron destroying competition and exploiting workers, provided evidence that he cared about public welfare that his business practices suggested he didn't care about at all. The Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913, with initial endowment of $100 million, some equivalent to perhaps $3 billion in contemporary terms, represented the institutionalization of his philanthropic giving, creating permanent organization that would deploy his wealth according to principles he established, and that would bear his name through generations after his death, ensuring that Rockefeller would be associated with charitable works and scientific advances and educational institutions that foundation would support rather than being remembered solely for monopolistic practices that courts had condemned. The foundation's work was genuinely valuable, funding medical research that contributed to developing vaccines and treatments for diseases that killed millions, supporting universities that trained generations of scientists and doctors and teachers, financing public health campaigns that improved sanitation and reduced infant mortality, and addressed various social problems that government wasn't yet adequately addressing, creating legacy of positive contributions that were real regardless of whether motivations for creating foundation were pure or calculated or mixed. But the question that critics asked then, and that historians continue debating, was whether blood money could be cleansed through charitable giving, whether wealth accumulated through exploitation and monopolization and practices that courts declared illegal could be redeemed by giving portions of that wealth to worthy causes, whether accepting Rockefeller money meant legitimizing the methods that had accumulated that money, whether universities and research institutions should accept donations from someone whose fortune came from destroying competitors and exploiting workers, even if those donations would fund important work that wouldn't otherwise be funded. Some institutions refused Rockefeller money on principle. They argued that accepting donations would associate them with his tainted fortune, would suggest that monopolistic practices were acceptable if monopolists eventually gave money to charity, would compromise their independence if they became dependent on funding from someone whose business interests might conflict with research findings or educational missions that honest inquiry might produce, choosing principle over pragmatism, even when that choice meant refusing funding that would have supported valuable work. Others accepted Rockefeller donations while trying to maintain distance from his business practices. They acknowledged that money's source was problematic, but argued that refusing donations would only punish the students and researchers and patients who would benefit from work that donations funded. That Standard Oil's monopoly had already happened and couldn't be undone by refusing its proceeds. That extracting wealth from monopolists and redirecting it toward public benefit was morally superior to allowing that wealth to remain in private hands, serving only Rockefeller family's interests. John's own understanding of his philanthropic legacy seemed to lack awareness of the contradictions that critics identified. He genuinely appeared to believe that charitable giving demonstrated his Christian character and social responsibility, genuinely seemed not to recognize tension between his business practices and his religious professions, genuinely thought that giving away portions of his fortune proved that he had society's welfare at heart, despite having accumulated that fortune through systematic destruction of competitive markets and exploitation of workers, whose welfare his business practices had disregarded completely. This capacity for compartmentalization that had allowed ruthless business practices to coexist with sincere religious faith also allowed him to give millions to charity, while seeing no contradiction with having taken far more through monopolistic practices, to fund medical research benefiting millions, while having denied basic safety protection to workers whose deaths in his refineries numbered in hundreds, to support universities training future generations, while having corrupted political systems and competitive markets that those generations would inherit. Forest Hill, during his final decades, became stage for entertaining the beneficiaries of his philanthropy. University presidents would visit to thank him for donations that funded new buildings or programs. Medical researchers would report on progress toward defeating diseases that his funding supported. Foundation administrators would brief him on how his wealth was being deployed according to his instructions, creating tableaux where elderly billionaire received gratitude and recognition, while his empire's darker history was politely ignored by people whose institutions benefited from wealth that controversial methods had accumulated. The visitors who came seeking donations learned to avoid mentioning Standard Oil's monopoly, or the antitrust case, or the labor practices, or any aspect of how the wealth they wanted to access had been accumulated. Learn to focus on future good that donations would enable rather than past evil that donations' source represented. Learn to perform gratitude without judgment, to accept money without acknowledging its taint, to participate in the fiction that philanthropy cleansed, rather than merely redirected wealth that monopoly had extracted from workers and consumers and competitors, whose suffering had generated the profits that charitable giving now deployed. John himself seemed to genuinely believe the fiction, to accept the gratitude as deserved rather than as strategic performance by people who wanted his money, to interpret his legacy as primarily philanthropic rather than primarily monopolistic, to die believing that history would remember him as benefactor rather than robber baron, that the foundations and universities and medical advances bearing his name would overshadow the monopoly and exploitation and corruption that had made those philanthropic achievements financially possible. The mask was convincing because substantial truth supported it. The Rockefeller Foundation did fund important work. The universities he supported did train generations of leaders and scholars. The medical research he financed did save lives and advance knowledge. But the mask remained mask nonetheless, covering darker truths that wealth couldn't erase and that charity couldn't fully cleanse, hiding the exploitation and destruction and corruption that had built the fortune that philanthropy deployed, creating legacy that was genuinely complex rather than simply good or simply evil, that required acknowledging both achievements and crimes rather than celebrating one while ignoring the other. The philanthropy was real. The achievements were substantial, the benefits were genuine, but the blood money remained blood money regardless of how charitably it was spent. The monopoly remained monopoly regardless of how much wealth it redistributed after extracting it. The legacy remained tainted regardless of how much later generations wanted to celebrate achievements while forgetting methods. demonstrating that some stains persist despite cleaning, that some truths endure despite concealment, that some costs can't be paid through later generosity because the damage was irreversible and the victims couldn't be compensated, and the competitive markets and democratic institutions that monopoly corrupted couldn't be restored through charitable foundations bearing monopolists' name. Mansions End Forest Hill, the mansion that had witnessed John D. Rockefeller's transformation from successful refiner into monopolist controlling American petroleum industry, that had hosted the strategic planning sessions where Standard Oil's predatory campaigns were designed, that had contained the family life where wealth destroyed relationships as efficiently as monopoly destroyed competition, faced uncertain future after John's death in 1937, as heirs who had rarely visited during his lifetime decided that maintaining the property served no purpose beyond sentiment they didn't feel, and that costs exceeded any value that preservation might provide. John D. Rockefeller Jr., who inherited the estate along with portions of his father's vast fortune, had complicated relationship with Forest Hill that mixed childhood memories of parental neglect with recognition that the mansion represented his father's achievements and crimes both, that preserving it would maintain monument to monopoly that courts had condemned, while destroying it would eliminate tangible connection to family history that included genuine accomplishments alongside the exploitation and corruption that had built the fortune. The decision came relatively quickly. Forest Hill would not be maintained as family residence or converted into museum or preserved as historical landmark, would instead be donated to a charitable purpose if suitable recipient could be found, or would be demolished if no appropriate use materialized, demonstrating that even Rockefeller wealth had limits when applied to maintaining properties that served no function beyond commemorating past, that family preferred not to celebrate too publicly given the complications that honest history revealed. In 1939, just 2 years after John S.R.'s death, the Cleveland Orchestra announced it would acquire Forest Hill's 86 acres to build summer concert venue, preserving the land while allowing demolition of the mansion that Cleveland's cultural institutions apparently saw no value in maintaining, that historical societies lacked resources to preserve, that represented era that America was moving beyond as New Deal reforms and labor protections and antitrust enforcement were creating regulated capitalism that rejected the monopolistic practices that Gilded Age had permitted and that Forest Hill symbolized. The mansion was dismantled rather than simply demolished, with architectural elements and furnishings sold at auction or donated to institutions, with materials salvaged for reuse rather than wasted, creating dispersal that made Forest Hill's physical presence disappear, while fragments survived in museums and historical societies and private collections, maintaining ghostly existence through objects that had once furnished rooms where monopoly was perfected, but that now existed divorced from context that would have explained their significance. The actual demolition proceeded through 1940 and 1941, as workers systematically dismantled the structure that John had built in 1873, and that had served as his primary residence for decades, as the rooms where Standard Oil's strategy was planned were reduced to rubble, as the grounds where John had walked while contemplating how to destroy competitors were transformed into open land that would host concerts rather than monopolization campaigns, eliminating the physical evidence of what had occurred there, while the historical record preserved knowledge that physical destruction couldn't erase. The Cleveland Orchestra's Blossom Music Center opened on the Forest Hill property in 1968, creating public cultural venue where private mansion had stood, allowing thousands of visitors annual access to land that John had controlled exclusively, transforming his estate from monument to monopoly into space serving community that his business practices had exploited, creating ironic justice through repurposing that gave back to public what monopoly had taken from competitive markets and workers, that standards practices had harmed. Today, visitors to Blossom Music Center who know the site's history can walk grounds where Forest Hill stood, can imagine the mansion that occupied the ridge where Concert Pavilion now rises, can contemplate the transformation from private wealth to public culture, from monopolist's sanctuary to community's gathering place, from symbol of Gilded Age excess to accessible venue where Cleveland residents of all economic classes can experience cultural events that Rockefeller wealth inadvertently enabled through the donation that made Blossom's creation possible. But most visitors don't know the history, don't recognize that they're walking where John D. Rockefeller planned Standard Oil's monopolization, don't realize that the parkland hosting their picnics and concerts was once private estate where America's richest man isolated himself from the public whose competitive markets his monopoly destroyed, demonstrating how quickly historical memory fades when physical evidence disappears, how easily the past can be forgotten when present uses override historical preservation, how thoroughly sites can be transformed when economic and cultural priorities shift, and when maintaining monuments to controversial figures seems less valuable than creating new purposes serving contemporary needs. John's other properties faced similar fates. Some were converted to institutional uses. Others were demolished. Few were preserved as historical sites because preserving robber baron's mansion seemed less important than preserving structures associated with figures whose legacies were less complicated by the monopolistic practices and labor exploitation and political corruption that Rockefeller's wealth represented, showing that historical preservation reflects values about which histories deserve commemorating, and that societies struggling with economic inequality and corporate power saw limited value in maintaining shrines to someone who exemplified concentrated wealth's threats to democratic governance and competitive markets. The irony was that while Forest Hill itself disappeared, the Rockefeller name persisted through the philanthropic foundations and the universities and the various institutions that his money had established or supported, creating legacy that emphasized charitable giving while downplaying monopolistic practices that had generated the wealth that charity deployed, allowing later generations to remember Rockefeller primarily as philanthropist rather than as robber baron, achieving through institutional permanence what physical monuments couldn't sustain, because societies reluctant to celebrate monopolists were quite willing to celebrate benefactors, even when benefactor and monopolist were same person at different life stages. The mansion's end represented physical erasure that historical erasure couldn't quite achieve. You could demolish Forest Hill, but you couldn't demolish the documented history of Standard Oil's monopolization, couldn't eliminate the court records condemning the company's practices, couldn't erase Ida Tarbell's exposés or the government's antitrust case, or the various contemporary accounts documenting how John built his fortune through systematic destruction of competition and exploitation of workers and corruption of political systems that should have constrained corporate power, but that Rockefeller wealth had purchased. The land remained, transformed but recognizable, hosting new purposes that served public rather than private interests, demonstrating that real estate persists even when the structures built upon it disappear, that geography outlasts architecture, that places can be repurposed when their original uses become obsolete or objectionable, that Forest Hill could become Blossom even though John D. Rockefeller could never quite become the purely benevolent philanthropist that later public relations would attempt to portray him as being. The end had come, the mansion was gone, the transformation was complete, but the questions remained about whether demolition served justice or merely erased evidence, whether eliminating physical monuments to robber barons helped society move forward, or simply allowed forgetting that made repeating similar patterns easier, whether the sites where monopolies were built should be preserved as warnings or destroyed as embarrassments, whether Forest Hill's demolition represented appropriate historical judgment, or convenient amnesia about capitalism's capacity to concentrate wealth in ways that threaten everything democracy requires to function. Blood money today, more than 85 years after John D. Rockefeller's death and over a century after Standard Oil's antitrust dissolution, his legacy remains contested terrain, where admirers celebrate his organizational genius and philanthropic giving, while critics condemn his monopolistic practices and the exploitation that built his fortune, where business schools teach case studies about his strategic brilliance, while historians document the human costs that his strategies imposed, where foundations bearing his name continue deploying his wealth toward charitable purposes, while the money remains tainted by the methods that accumulated it. The fortune he built has persisted and grown through shrewd management and reinvestment, with Rockefeller family wealth estimated in contemporary terms at multiple billions, distributed across dozens of heirs who benefit from great-great-grandfather's monopolization of petroleum industry, despite having no personal connection to the practices that generated the wealth they inherited, demonstrating that exploitation's benefits can be transferred across generations even when exploitation itself is eventually prohibited, that blood money retains its value even when its origins are acknowledged as criminal or, at minimum, unethical. The philanthropic institutions he established, Rockefeller Foundation, Rockefeller University, various other organizations bearing his name, have funded genuinely important work, advancing medical research and scientific knowledge and educational opportunities that benefited millions who never knew and don't care that funding came from monopoly profits extracted through practices that courts condemned as illegal restraint of trade, showing that money laundering through time and charity can transform reputation from robber baron to benefactor, even though transformation doesn't change historical reality of how wealth was actually accumulated. Universities that accepted his donations struggled with questions about whether naming buildings after him honored his philanthropy or legitimized his monopolistic practices, whether associating prestigious institutions with his name suggested that extreme wealth justified itself regardless of methods that produced it, whether refusing to celebrate him would disrespect donors who had given in his honor, or would represent honest acknowledgement that some fortunes are too tainted to celebrate, even when later charitable deployment of those fortunes produced genuine benefits. The debate about Rockefeller's legacy connects directly to contemporary arguments about inequality and corporate power, and whether successful business people are job creators deserving celebration or exploiters deserving regulation, whether billionaires' charitable giving redeems their wealth accumulation or merely attempts to purchase legitimacy that their business practices don't deserve, whether we should emphasize the jobs and economic growth that Standard Oil created or the competitors it destroyed and workers it exploited and markets it monopolized. Those who defend Rockefeller's legacy argue that he organized chaotic petroleum industry and made kerosene affordable for ordinary Americans who benefited from Standard Oil's efficiency, even if competitors and workers suffered from its monopolistic practices, that his methods were typical of his era, when regulations didn't yet exist to constrain business tactics that later generations would prohibit, that judging historical figures by contemporary ethical standards is anachronistic when they operated under different legal and moral frameworks, that his philanthropy demonstrated genuine desire to benefit society regardless of what motivated the giving. Those who condemn his legacy argue that his monopolization destroyed competitive markets that would have served consumers better through genuine competition, rather than through monopolies' artificial efficiency, that his exploitation of workers was extreme even by Gilded Age's minimal standards, that his corruption of political systems damaged democratic governance in ways that persisted long after his death, that his philanthropy represented strategic public relations designed to rehabilitate reputation rather than genuine charity, that celebrating him sends message that extreme wealth justifies itself regardless of how it's accumulated. The truth, as usual, resists simple categorization. John D. Rockefeller was simultaneously organizational genius who transformed petroleum industry and ruthless monopolist who destroyed competitive markets, was both sincere Christian who genuinely believed in charitable giving and calculating businessman who recognized philanthropy's public relations value, was both devoted family man by his own lights and emotionally absent father by his children's experience, embodied both American dream of rising from modest circumstances to vast wealth and American nightmare of concentrated economic power threatening democratic governance. Forest Hill's site, where concerts now occur instead of monopolization being planned, represents this complexity. The land serves public benefit through cultural programming that Rockefeller wealth inadvertently enabled, but history remembers what occurred there before transformation, recognizes that public benefit doesn't erase private exploitation that preceded it, understands that Blossom Music Center's existence doesn't cleanse Standard Oil's monopolistic practices, even though transformation from private estate to public venue represents appropriate redistribution of concentrated wealth toward community benefit. The blood money persists in foundations and universities, and the various institutions that deployed Rockefeller wealth toward charitable purposes, in family members whose inherited fortunes trace directly to great-grandfather's monopolization of petroleum industry, in the corporate successors to Standard Oil like ExxonMobil and Chevron, whose origins trace to the monopoly that antitrust action dissolved, but that reconfigured components have rebuilt into dominant positions through mergers that regulators approved, despite obvious parallels to monopolistic consolidation that courts had previously condemned. The pattern suggests that breaking monopolies doesn't prevent their eventual reconstitution when regulatory vigilance fades, and when corporate power can influence the political systems that should constrain it. That wealth concentration that Gilded Age produced hasn't been eliminated, but merely transformed into new forms that contemporary society tolerates, because they are less obvious than Standard Oil's monopoly was. That the lessons that Rockefeller's career should have taught about capitalism's need for regulation and corporate powers, threats to democracy and concentrated wealths, corruption of political systems, haven't been learned completely enough to prevent repetition of similar patterns under different names and different industries. The ultimate assessment of John D. Rockefeller's legacy must acknowledge both his genuine accomplishments and his genuine crimes, both the organizational innovations that transformed American industry and the monopolistic practices that destroyed competitive markets, both the philanthropic giving that funded important work and the exploitation that generated the wealth that charity deployed, both the business genius that built empire and the ruthlessness that empire building required, and the human costs that ruthlessness imposed on workers and competitors, and the democratic institutions that monopolies' political influence corrupted. He was neither pure villain nor pure hero, but complex human, whose life demonstrated both human capacity for achievement and human capacity for rationalization that allows crimes to be committed while maintaining conviction of righteousness, who showed both what American capitalism could accomplish when entrepreneurial energy was unleashed, and what American capitalism required in regulatory constraints when that energy manifested as monopolistic power, threatening everything that competitive markets and democratic governance depend upon. The mansion where his empire was built is gone, demolished, and transformed into space serving public rather than private purposes. But the questions that Forest Hill witnessed and that John D. Rockefeller's life embodied remain urgently relevant. How much inequality should society tolerate? How much corporate power should democracy permit? Whether extreme wealth justifies itself through philanthropy or merely attempts to purchase redemption that ethical business practices would have made unnecessary. Whether we learn from history or merely celebrate victors, while forgetting what their victories cost and whom those victories harmed. That is the hidden story inside John D. Rockefeller's mansion, where America's oil empire began, where monopoly was perfected, where wealth was built through methods that courts condemned, where family was sacrificed to business obsessions, where philanthropy attempted to cleanse blood money that historical memory refuses to forget, where the contradictions of American capitalism were embodied in single man, whose fortune demonstrated both the system's capacity to generate wealth and its capacity to concentrate that wealth in ways that threaten the competitive markets and democratic institutions that America's prosperity and freedom both depend upon.